Okay, so thanks so much for joining us today, Stephen. Stephen Wakabayashi is the founder of Mindful Sites, a nonprofit organization dedicated to making mindfulness more accessible to minority communities. After recovering from a life-threatening illness, he left his corporate job to study meditation at Buddhist monasteries around the world, including Tushita in northern India with the Dalai Lama, Plum Village in southern France with Thich Nhat Han, Japan, Thailand, UK, and across the US. His teachings are inspired by both traditional Eastern and modern Western practices. He grounds his practice in community and can often be found collaborating with organizations like us, LGBTQ and BIPOC spaces, and leaders in making this teaching and practice more equitable and accessible to communities. So thank you so much for joining us from San Francisco today, and I'll just hand it over to you, and you can do whatever time you like.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. I just want to do a quick accessibility check. Everyone hear me okay? See me okay? Yes. Awesome. And if by any means video or sound isn't coming through properly, or I'm going too slow or too fast, feel free to message it as well into the chat. I have it open, more than happy to accommodate where I can. And yeah, a little bit about myself. So Asian male, queer Asian man, curly hair, wearing black turtleneck in a interesting hotel room here in San Francisco, otherwise known as the territory for the unceded tribe of Ohlone, Ramaytush, and Muwekma tribes. The Ohlone tribe are known for being skilled basket makers, wonderful, wonderful. And then the Ramaytush tribes have been also known for skilled dancing as well. So little facts. Yes. So what I'm going to do with our session today is I'll have a little bit of an introspection moment at the beginning, and then we'll do a short meditation at the end. And by any means, if any questions or anything comes up, feel free to also type into chat. But today, really, the idea is thinking about the concept of compassion, but also through the lens of this crazy time that we're in, right? This crazy world that we're sitting in, experiencing through our soul, through our bodies, through just mentally, just everything that's happening. And so, really, today, my prompt for you all is see if you can all show up compassionately for yourself, whether it's just as simply as sitting in a position that's comfortable for you. I know sometimes in meditation, we're trying so hard to sit upright, right? If you're called to just lie down and listen, feel free to do so as well. If also you're called to turn on your video, turn it on. If you feel called to turn off your video, turn it off, right? Just use this space as you wish to just sit with a little bit of the teachings and see what you can take out of it as well. Yeah. And so during our talk too, we'll chat a little bit about compassion and also just kind of defining what it is, asking ourselves, what's the point of it, right? When is an issue sometimes for us as we talk about compassion within our work that we do? And lastly, why is this so important for us within our liberation as well as for our communities as well? Myself, I do a ton of work working with communities, and Mindful Sites, what we do is we host support groups through the context of empowering folks through different lived experiences to hold safe spaces for other folks who also experience the same lived experiences that you have. So specifically right now, we hold spaces for queer Asian folks, for our Asian community, and most recently we started BIPOC space. And we're really excited to also connect with spaces such as yourself to help cross-pollinate. And I'm also coming in through Don Mauricio. Huge recommendation. She is also uplifting your work as well from the community. And so I love for us to just first start with a short intention setting exercise. And this will be really simple. If you want to bring your eyes to a gentle close and just find yourself in a nice, comfortable seated position, whether it's sitting all the way in the back of your seat or just lying down, and with your hands, just feel free to just plop it where it feels most comfortable. Maybe it's on your knees or near your thighs or stomach. And I want you to think about this word, compassion, as it shows up, right? Compassion. When I say the word compassion, what shows up for you? Is it a feeling? Is it a sensation? Or maybe a person or a place? Maybe it doesn't have words to describe what it is. Maybe there's a color associated. When I say the word compassion, what shows up for you? And feel free to slowly open your eyes and come back in. And why I want to start with that simple exercise is whatever comes up for us individually uh, is warranted to be its own thing, right? And sometimes when I hear these talks and we sit through it, one thing I also want to underscore is we all have our myriad of lived experiences and sensations, um, feelings, thoughts, emotions, uh, memories, right? That come with these words as we unpack it. And a big teaching that we work on also with our organization is the experience of not having to even define it with words. So, what I will speak today, again, is limited with the diction that I'm using, which is American diction. We only have a certain amount of words, certain amount of letters to describe what it is. And so, also understand that these feelings and these sentiments, what I will share is my own experiences, and it may not be everyone else's as well. And that I hope to share with you a little bit about what compassion means to me, and hopefully that may also provide you with more vocabulary or experiences or understanding of that word as well. Yeah. And so if we ask the same question to other people, compassion, what does it mean to you? What comes out for you? A lot of authors, scholars will describe it as simply sympathy for another being, feelings of maybe warmth, happiness, joy comes up. Sometimes people say it's a little bit of hardship, right? Compassion may not come so easily for them. And some people who have people that show up for their mind. Maybe it's their loved ones, caregivers, children, maybe pets, compassion. Even some people say babies. Some people say babies are the most enlightened beings. Buddhists say that. And some people have this feeling that it is even greater than ourselves, this word compassion, the way for us to connect with one another. And Buddhists describe it as this word karuna, and I'm sure you've heard it many times in the past, as one of the or Brahma Viharas, really as a way to be virtuous with one's life, right? To have this also adjacent feelings of empathy, sympathy, and willingness to bear pain of others, ultimately for us to be more aware of one another, right? And this interesting notion of also these adjacent feelings and emotions and why it's really important to Brene Brown recently has a book out that I highly recommend. It's called Atlas of the Heart, and basically the book is a dictionary of different emotions, quite fascinating, and go through chapter and chapter and chapter of different emotions and actually break down the concepts of even like compassion versus empathy. And I won't go through it in our little talk today, but one thing I want to share a little bit about is these adjacent emotions help to feed our awareness of the word compassion and our understanding of it. And so, for example, empathy is a word that comes up a lot, is this practice of understanding what other people are going through, how they are feeling. And it's not just simply feeling the same thing, right? Because we're like, oh, you feel it, I feel it. But it's quite simply being aware of it, right? And what is interesting too is also thinking about this root of compassion, right? So we talked a little bit about this understanding that it comes through, some of the scholars and authors that talked about to learn from one another, but also we see this happening with animals, right? Where animals develop caring and nurturing behaviors for their young as right after they're born, right? There are these amazing videos of animals being birthed. I was just watching on I think it was TikTok or YouTube. And it was this rhino being born. And right after it was being born, you just saw the rhino caregiver immediately go tend towards its the birth of its child, and starting to nurture it, taking off all of the gunk that comes with it, right? We see this with dogs as its children are birthed to immediately start licking it, right? As the way to not just care for it, but to wake it up. And we see the same thing also with humans. As we have babies being born, we burp it immediately so that it can take its first breath of air. And also, we see this not just within a certain species, right? But we also see this within species to other species. We see a symbiotic relationship starting to form intrinsically as animals are born and not even speaking the same language, right? For example, we see fish have a really interesting relationship with, um, shoot, I forgot the name, but the little the little organism with the little tentacles, and it like zaps other things, but certain type of fish, right? I believe it's a clownfish, and it's just able to swim and be a part of it, finding protection within it. But it also drops little food particles in return. And if animals can't speak the same language, right, and this care for one another develops, we see that this understanding of compassion for one another is really a part of oh, a jellyfish, yes. Um, uh, yeah, again, English is a very limited language for myself as well. And so we see this, right, as this really important aspect of also not just within living and experiencing life, but also within survival, right? So to survive is also to have compassion for one another, and also the compassion with species as well. Again, like biodiversity is so important because without, again, all of us being a part of this larger ecosystem, the larger world, right? Earth as we know it would not also survive. And so this larger organism that we are a part of also depends on the interdependence of all of its parts, right? On a smaller scale for us individually as organisms, we see the cells, right, have to cooperate and have intrinsically compassion, as one might call, right, for one another. Think about if our white blood cells does not have compassion for other cells within our body. It's unfortunately that's what leukemia looks like, right? But that's when we start also developing cancer within our body. And so we see this as an intrinsic and important aspect of all of our beings and all of our survival and our thriving of one another. And although we see, right, compassion as this important thing, as this paramount object that will allow us to thrive and survive, sometimes we see compassion come out in ways that are often harmful to one another, right? And what I like to call the harmfulness of compassion is when it crosses hairs with certain other attributes, seven deadly sins, right, as we might call it. An example is when compassion crosses with sloth or laziness, for example. We call this lazy compassion. An example could be compassion that comes through this overarching notion of this trend that we see on social media, right? Hashtag good vibes only, where they're like, I don't want to hear anything that you have to say, all the problems of the world, right? It doesn't apply to me or the spaces I inhabit. Just bring your happiness and joy, right? And sometimes we're like, actually, what I'm feeling is really valid. It's important. The house is burning, right? And this is also important as we talk about social justice, right? Where if we have just this blanket compassion, sometimes it doesn't allow us to dive in deeper into truly understanding, right? Again, the root of empathy requires us to understand one another at an intrinsic level of understanding the good and the bad feelings, right? The easy and difficult feelings, right? And what I like this other phrasing that this other Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, says this lazy compassion is called is also idiot compassion in a way that it's not just lazy, but it also is enabling. It enables this short-term, transactional almost type of shift, right, for the loss of long-term impact that we need. This idiot compassion is sacrificing this long-term gain, this long-term movement for the immediate short-term gratification that we are seeking. And Chogyam Trungpa's student, Pema Chodron, who's quite popular, whose books I highly recommend, also talks about this concept of idiot compassion as this tendency to give people what they want because you can't bear to see them suffering, right? And so why also, again, this understanding of these adjacent emotions is important is because when we, again, don't have the root of empathy, this true intrinsic understanding of one another, sometimes we do not allow ourselves to accept the suffering of others because we are struggling to understand it. And also on the flip side, right? So this is not enough compassion, true compassion, right? Driven through empathy. Sometimes on the flip side, we can have too much compassion, empathy. But again, though some will say this is a part of this lazy compassion where it's like, oh yeah, no, I'll give you everything, right? Sometimes we can just bear too much and overextend ourselves and oftentimes burn ourselves out, right? And so I'm definitely really guilty of this, where I overextend myself, I give way too much. And a point in this is also understanding just where do we sit. Again, another crosshair intersection to be wary of and to be more aware of is when it crosshairs with the ego, right? Again, I like to preface that not everything is these extremes, and really the understanding and the true progression towards just being a good human being, I think, is ultimately creating balance of all these different teaching, right? And the next one is again like creating boundaries, but then we create too much boundaries and then we center ourselves, right? Let's say we only center ourselves within this compassion, then we can be performative in it, right? We do compassion for how we appear on the outside to others, right? Performative activism is really quite a fascinating thing to observe, where you don't only look good to others, but on social media right now, performative activism is great because for brands, it's bringing them money, right? It's being able to sell products on the, the precipice that you're trying to help somehow by, buying all these products and being a part of this awful, awful system of capitalism that is right now squeezing us for all we've got, right? And as we talk about these resources, attention, money, fame, power, it pays good to be compassionate on the outside, right? And why some of these things are good to be aware of as we talk about this understanding of compassion is it's also we're being presented, right, with just it's like a lot of really interesting personalities right now in life. And we're like, well, should I be compassionate? Should I not be compassionate? And I don't think it's as simple as an answer as that, right? It also requires to assess where we are with ourselves and how much we're able to give. And I think it's again this balance of assessing where we are, how much we're able to give, and then assessing in how do we want to deliver it, right? Through these contexts and these crosshairs to be aware of. And one thing to also take into account, again, as we talk about these root emotions that feed into compassion, and we need to have, sometimes we can have adjacent emotions that compassion, while it exists, it is also fueling these other parts, right? And so in Buddhism, we have this term called near enemy emotions that comes up. Thank you for sharing the book. Highly recommend it. And also, I highly recommend getting the audiobook if you have local library. Uh, they've been buying a ton of, Brene Brown's been donating a ton of these books to local libraries internationally too. And also has different anecdotes. But anyway, Buddhism has this also interesting concept called near enemy emotions, where we have emotions that show up sometimes as positive virtues, such as compassion, but then undermines our larger goal, right? And so, what's really fascinating with a lot of these words is, again, we're so limited to our diction, and sometimes things just don't need a word to describe what it is, right? But I think as we want to assess and show and ask ourselves, how do I want to show up in the world? I think it's just ultimately this myriad of understanding awareness, again, of where we're at, how much energy, resources do we have available that we're able to give, right? And then also assessing what type of impact do we want to make and where do we sit with that impact, right? And so what I also want to share next is we talked about this understanding of compassion as karuna, and why I'm going to share a little bit of a story that's very near and dear to my heart. And I think what is important to underscore is true compassion is actually not easy. When compassion comes really easy, that's when we have to be aware of, again, sloth, right? Laziness. It's truly, how do I want to say that? Compassion that would shift needles, especially for even ours and our liberation, is something that takes a ton of time to understand, and to truly sit with and to give unconditionally. And one example I will give is myself and my experience of just coming out, being gay, being queer. I come from a family that is Asian, and I would say within my family, being queer and gay is not a thing, and I do not have any immediate relatives that are openly out. Statistically, there should be, right? But none that are openly out, and definitely in my own journey of coming out, it's been very difficult. I came out to my mother a few years ago. No, many years ago, actually. um, 5 or 6 years ago. But again, before that, I was like very much out and about doing things. And it's funny because I do so much in the community, all this social activism work, but my family just like really has a tough time with it. My father unfortunately passed away when I was young, and all I have is my mother, and she just really struggled with it when I came out. She cried for weeks, and when this is your only parent, it's just really tough. And I also cried for weeks too. And just one thing, it's just like embracing this truth about yourself, but people can't see it, right? And still to this day, we don't really talk about it. And it's really this kind of, it almost feels like a hollowness for myself. And as I sat in reflection about this for many years, actually, one thing that I noted that was really, really hard also was this, again, this juxtaposition of this reaction that I was seeing in my family, right? Versus what I was seeing on YouTube, right? It's like it gets better. And you see all these videos, everyone hugging, embracing, and having parties. And I was like, this is not my party, you know. Um, and I mean, we still don't talk about it at all, but at least she doesn't ask if I have a girlfriend or anymore. It's like at least we're getting there. Um, but it's just, again, going back to this concept of compassion, I found it so hard, right, to give this understanding of compassion to my mother. And one thing I think Western media does an awful, awful job of doing is when people don't see us where we're at, our immediate inclination should be to abstain them from any part of us, any being of us, right? And again, I don't use this as a blanket statement. If people come from us from a harmful position, I think that's very different, right? But again, with my mother in my story, it was so hard to deduce, like, well, does she love me? And I could clearly say forthright, like, yes, she loves me, but this aspect of me, she was having trouble loving, right, or accepting. And this also, again, this understanding of compassion, it's so easy to say, I have to give compassion to every part of every being, right? And I think it's harder to say, I acknowledge that I'm struggling to be compassionate for somebody, for my mother in this instance, to embrace this aspect of me, right? And this also complexity, again, of human lives, I think is rarely portrayed and painted really well, again, with movies, right, where we want this happy ending, or we're just like, we're so happy and we embrace the fact that this antagonist, sorry, has like completely been decimated and, you know, abolished and gone. And I think one concept of Buddhism is also this understanding that we're all here, you know, we just got to figure out what to do with one another on this crazy journey. And as unraveling this, again, I saw this portrayal within media that was telling me, if I wasn't getting compassion back, I have to turn to ignorance, resentment, disconnection. And sometimes that, I think that is the hardest part. And I think that is, again, this root of karuna, which is especially those who are so close to us, right? Who don't meet us or see us exactly where we need them to. Where does compassion sit within that relationship? And I think karuna, in the way I define it, is it doesn't have to just be I give you compassion, but I think karuna is this study and this understanding and this depth of what do I want to do with that aspect, right? And especially for us here sitting here, I'm sure there have been so many times, right, where we've been in situations being misunderstood, misidentified, mis just connected with other folks. And I think one thing to just acknowledge too is just it exists, right? And the other part is, where do I sit, right? With also compassion, but also validating, right, the experiences that I've gone through. I want to underscore, right? In order to give compassion, we don't have to just forgive and forget everything, right? This is not in this case at all. We can also hold the space of remembering, the space of holding people accountable, right? And also the space of compassion for that. And I think why all of this is so tough is because there is no simple formula for it, right? And as we talk about, where are we headed to, even just with us as a larger community, of just human beings, I think where we just need to be aware of and wary of is just, especially within media, right? It paints so many people to be so many different ways. And the honest reality is we are all so, so complex. No one is perfect, but at the same time, not all parts of anyone is also perfect, right? I'm sure there are points when we will be in heart to connection with one another. I'm sure there are points when you and I will disagree with things, and I'm very opinionated about many TV shows. I'm sure I'm like, I love it, I hate it, like, and so I think this is one thing to really think about is compassion is a very multi-layered thing. And for us to really truly embrace this concept of compassion, karuna, is really to also then accept that human beings and other people we love around us are multi-layered, multifaceted beings, right? But one thing to also think about is this concept of unconditional compassion. What does that look like, right? We oftentimes hear unconditional love for others, but sometimes we can hold unconditional compassion for those that we may struggle to see eye to eye with. Again, underscoring being in a position of being hurt or being put in very other complex situation. Sometimes those might not be the situation to show unconditional compassion just yet. But again, it's very multi-layered and faceted, right? And also holding people accountable to a certain degree is also holding compassion for them and their growth as beings, right? And one thing that I learned back to my story with my mother was that just understanding her history and where she came from, especially within a rural area of Taiwan, as farmers, um, uh, was a definite opportunity to just be so inundated with very close-minded thinking and just a single way of life, right? No access to technology, right? To be connected to one another that you may not be locally within, or to even have gay friends. I've never been introduced to any of my friends that have been gay, or queer, anyone from our little alphabet mafia. And so it's just one of those things that I just have acknowledged that has been a great teacher of mine. It's just reflecting and sitting with opportunities where I acknowledge I'm struggling to show compassion, but in asking myself, where can I show up? Um, have taught me a lot more about this concept of karuna and really what this means. Yeah. Ultimately, I think going back to maybe how to even get there, I found that one of the biggest things that helped me tremendously was sitting with self compassion, giving myself, again, this unconditional compassion first, working for myself, working on myself, so that this container that I had overflowed with extra compassion that I didn't necessarily need tethered to anything else, right? And my understanding of this bigger picture was acknowledging first it was unseen, unheard, and rejected, but then developing it, working on myself first, and then filling it outwards to understand that a lot of us were just not born into the best circumstances or the structures, right? Heteropatriarchy, structures of whiteness, systemic marginalization, right? We're born with different constructs that are given, afforded to us, some more easily than others, some unfortunately forced upon others. And as we learn to figure out what we do with one another, is to develop, again, this root of empathy with all of those backgrounds. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I want to leave with you all again is this concept of karuna, compassion. And then how do we cultivate it, especially in this time, is again, this underlying concept that it's not easy, true karuna. It isn't also fixing someone again, or bypassing, just accepting. We call that lazy compassion, right? Or idiot compassion. And it ultimately is not just a single way to be performative on the outside, but rather something that we can truly keep within us, and help us learn more about ourselves and others as well. Yeah. Awesome. Um, And so I want to do a short meditation exercise, yeah, for like a few minutes, and then I'll have a few minutes for Q&A, ask questions. And so I want us to find a nice, comfortable seated position. And this is going to be a little bit of mantra meditation. I want you to bring your eyes to a gentle close. Yeah. And just be compassionate first with your body, this physical being, right? Allow your hand to just off wherever feels comfortable. Sometimes we like to hold stiffness in our hands through positions and maybe grasping, and maybe see this as opportunity. Just let that go, let that release, and maybe feel the weight of that hand, right? What does it feel like? Feel the weight of maybe your body now sitting into the seat. And what does that feel like? Maybe the weight of your back. You can feel into the weight of the seat. If you're sitting on the ground, maybe you feel the firmness of the ground. Yeah. And our legs there. See if you could just let it be, let it fall, and allow whatever ground is below you to just be there, coexist, and allow yourself to drape yourself against it in this format. Yeah. And with your breathing, no need to have a structure of breathing as well. Breathe in when you feel called to, and breathe out when your lungs yearn for it. You might feel irregular, it might feel shallow. And just allow yourself to oscillate, ping pong between these 2 points of exhale and inhale without any tension. And you might notice that's simply allowing you to go into a really relaxed, rested state. Sometimes I like to go into this compassionate body, compassionate breath, so that I can just simply be, to just simply sit with. Yeah. What does this feel like for you right now? If this feels a little bit different than what you're used to in your meditation exercise, sitting exercise, and what is coming up for you? May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I accept myself exactly as I am, my whole self, the parts that I dearly love, and also the parts that I'm struggling with, the parts that are seen, the parts that are unseen. The parts that are loved, the parts that are a work in progress. May I give myself the compassion that I need in this moment, all the compassion that I need, so that I may show up for myself, my whole self. And may I hold compassion and empathy for myself and donate and don onto others what I may have too much of, and show up for others around me as well in the way that I can give and provide that is still nourishing for myself. Mm. Beautiful. Beautiful exercise, everyone. If you want to wiggle your toes, wiggle your fingers, out of your eyes open. And you all have a bit of compassion for yourself this evening. Yes. Yeah.